I found the card before anyone else sat down, placed neatly beside my plate as if it had always belonged there, as if it had been waiting for me specifically. And for a moment, I thought it was something kind, something thoughtful, because that's what I used to expect from family gatherings like this, especially on Thanksgiving. But when I opened it and read the single line written in careful, deliberate handwriting, I realized kindness had nothing to do with it anymore. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even openly cruel, but it was precise, like a needle slipped between ribs. Some people should learn when it's time to step aside. And I just stood there in my own dining room, the smell of roasted turkey still warm in the air, the cranberry sauce I had made from scratch cooling on the counter, the same way I had done every year for over 3 decades. And yet suddenly none of it felt like mine anymore. I looked up slowly, half expecting someone to laugh, to say it was a misunderstanding. But instead I saw Vanessa at the far end of the kitchen island, smiling as she adjusted the sleeves of her cream-colored sweater, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, and my son Daniel standing beside her, scrolling through his phone like the moment didn't exist, like I didn't exist. I closed the card carefully, my fingers steady, even though something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name yet, and I placed it back down exactly where I found it. Because I had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly only gave people what they wanted. The chairs began to fill one by one, voices rising, laughter bouncing off the walls I had painted myself 10 years ago, and I moved through it all the way I always had, setting dishes, pouring drinks, making sure everyone had what they needed. But this time it felt different, like I was watching someone else play my role from across the room. Vanessa thanked me loudly for hosting, her voice sweet, enough to fool anyone who didn't know her, and a few guests nodded in agreement, complimenting the table, the food, the effort, and I smiled back, because that's what was expected, because that's what I had always done. But every now and then my eyes drifted back to that card, still sitting quietly beside my plate, untouched by anyone else, as if it had been invisible to the rest of the room. Dinner carried on like nothing was wrong, like nothing had changed, but I noticed the small things I used to overlook, the way conversations stopped when I walked closer, the way decisions about seating and plans were made without even a glance in my direction, the way Vanessa seemed to guide everything with subtle gestures. A hand here, a look there, and Daniel followed without question. I told myself I might be imagining it. That grief from losing my husband 2 years ago had made me more sensitive, more prone to reading into things that weren't there. But then Vanessa laughed at something someone said and added, almost too casually, "Well, you know how it is, sometimes the older generation just doesn't realize when it's time to let go." And the table chuckled softly, not cruelly, not openly, but enough. I kept my smile in place, lifted my glass, and nodded as if I agreed. Because in that moment I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't about a single card or a single comment. It was a pattern, something carefully built over time, something that had been happening right in front of me while I was too busy holding everything together to notice it falling apart. And as I sat there surrounded by people who used to feel like home, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't going to end at this table. I did not mention the card again that night, not because I forgot it, but because I needed to understand it, to see if it was an isolated moment or something deeper that had been unfolding right in front of me for far longer than I cared to admit. So I stayed quiet and watched, the way you do when you realize you might have been missing something important for years. After dinner, as I cleared the plates and wrapped the leftovers into neat containers the way I always had, I listened to the rhythm of the house, to the way Vanessa's voice carried from the living room as she spoke about future plans that did not include me, about renovations, about possibly expanding the house, about turning what used to be my husband's study into a nursery someday. And no one corrected her. No one even glanced in my direction to acknowledge that those decisions had once been mine to make. Daniel laughed at something she said, a soft, easy laugh that used to belong to a different version of him, one who would have noticed if I had gone quiet, one who would have stepped into the kitchen to help me dry the dishes the way he did when he was younger. But now he stayed where he was, comfortable, distant, as if the space between us had become something permanent. I rinsed a plate slowly, watching the water run over the surface, and I tried to remember when things had started to change, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small shifts that I had dismissed at the time, the missed calls that were never returned, the holidays that were suddenly scheduled around other priorities. The subtle way Vanessa began to speak for Daniel, even when he was standing right there, as if his voice no longer belonged entirely to him. I told myself back then that it was normal, that families evolve, that children grow up and build lives of their own. But standing there in my own kitchen, I could not ignore the pattern anymore. It was too clear, too deliberate, like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place after years of being scattered. Later that evening, when the house had quieted and the guests had gone, I walked back into the dining room and found the card. Exactly where I had left it, still untouched by anyone else. And that detail mattered more than anything written inside it, because it meant this had been meant only for me. A message delivered quietly, privately, without witnesses, which made it more intentional, not less. I picked it up again, reading the line one more time, letting the words settle differently now that I understood the context around them. And I thought about all the times I had chosen peace over confrontation, all the times I had smiled through discomfort because I believed it was my role to hold the family together, to smooth over tension, to make things easier for everyone else. And I wondered if that had been my mistake, not kindness itself, but the way I had allowed it to be mistaken for weakness. The house felt larger than usual that night, the silence stretching into corners that used to be filled with conversation, with my husband's voice, with the kind of warmth that does not need to be forced. And I stood there for a long moment, holding that small piece of paper, realizing that whatever had been happening was no longer subtle. It had simply been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment I was ready to see it. I placed the card inside the drawer by the dining table instead of throwing it away, because something told me I might need it later, not as proof for anyone else, but as a reminder for myself. A marker of the moment, everything shifted from confusion to clarity, from doubt to understanding, and as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a pattern revealing itself fully. And for the first time, I was no longer willing to ignore it. I started to see it everywhere after that night, not in loud, obvious ways, but in the quiet spaces between words, in the pauses that stretched just a second too long, in the way conversations shifted direction the moment I entered the room, as if someone had gently closed a door without making a sound. And once I noticed it, I could not unsee it. A few days later, Vanessa invited me to join them for coffee at a place downtown. One of those polished cafes with large windows and soft music, playing just loud enough to keep conversations private. And I remember thinking it might be an attempt to reconnect, a small gesture to smooth over whatever tension I had imagined. But even then, something in me stayed cautious, like a part of me had already learned not to trust the surface of things. When I arrived, they were already seated, Daniel scrolling through his phone again, while Vanessa stirred her coffee slowly, watching the swirl as if it held more interest than the conversation itself. And she greeted me warmly, too warmly, with a brightness that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. And I sat down across from them, placing my hands neatly in my lap, waiting. The conversation began lightly. Talk about the weather, about a neighbor who had recently moved, about a new restaurant opening across town. All the safe topics that filled space without saying anything meaningful. But beneath it, I felt the same current I had felt at the dinner table, something unspoken moving steadily beneath the surface, guiding everything. Then Vanessa mentioned the wedding, casually at first, as if it were just another item on a list, the venue, the guest count, the colors, and I listened as she described details that had already been decided, finalized even, without a single question directed at me, without even the courtesy of pretending to include me in the process. And Daniel nodded along, adding small comments here and there, confirming plans I had never been told about. I smiled politely, asked a few questions, the kind that made it seem like I was simply catching up rather than realizing I had been left out entirely. And that was when I understood something that settled deep in my chest with a quiet finality. This was not forgetfulness. This was design. As Vanessa spoke, she leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice just enough to create the illusion of intimacy. And she said, almost as if she were offering advice rather than making a statement, that weddings today were very different, that traditions needed to evolve, that sometimes it was better when fewer voices were involved in planning because it made everything smoother, cleaner, more modern. And she smiled when she said it. The same controlled smile I had seen so many times before, and Daniel did not disagree. I nodded again, because that was what I had always done. But inside, the pieces continued to align, each memory rising up to meet the present, forming a pattern that was no longer subtle, no longer easy to dismiss. And I thought about the card in my drawer, about the words written so carefully, so deliberately, and I realized it had not been a suggestion. It had been a statement of intent. When the check came, Daniel reached for it automatically. Another small shift that might have gone unnoticed before, but now felt significant, as if roles had been reassigned without discussion, as if I had already been moved into a different place in their lives without ever being told. And as we stood to leave, Vanessa touched my arm lightly, her gesture gentle, almost affectionate, and she said she was so glad I could make time to join them, as if I were a guest rather than part of the foundation that had made all of this possible. I walked to my car alone, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, and I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, letting the silence settle around me. And for the first time, I did not try to explain it away. I did not search for kinder interpretations or softer meanings. I simply accepted what I was seeing, what I had been seeing all along, that something had shifted in a way that was not accidental, not temporary, but intentional, carefully built over time. And as I drove home, I realized that whatever came next would not be a surprise, because the pattern had already revealed itself, and all that remained was to see how far it would go. The house felt different when I got back that afternoon, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was seeing it without the filter I had relied on for years, the filter that softened edges and filled in gaps with assumptions of goodwill. And as I walked through each room, I began to notice how many decisions had already been made without me. Small things at first, like the framed photos in the hallway that had been rearranged. My husband's picture moved slightly to the side to make space for newer memories that did not include me, or the stack of mail placed neatly on the console table with my name pushed underneath the others, as if it were less urgent, less important. I moved slowly, taking it all in, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet awareness that made everything sharper, clearer. And when I reached the study that used to belong to my husband, I paused in the doorway, because the change there was impossible to ignore. The desk had been cleared, the papers gone, replaced with a catalog of nursery furniture left open as if someone had been browsing just moments before. And for a second I stood there, remembering the evenings he used to sit in that chair, reading, writing notes in the margins of books, calling out to me when he found something he wanted to share, and I realized that space had already been reassigned in their minds, repurposed for a future that did not require my presence. I did not step inside. Not yet. Instead, I turned back toward the dining room, toward the drawer where I had placed the card, and I opened it again, reading the line once more, but this time it felt less like a question and more like confirmation, a message that had been quietly reinforced by everything I had just seen. And I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that understanding settle into something steady rather than overwhelming. It would have been easy to confront them, to ask direct questions, to demand explanations, but I knew that would only lead to careful answers, rehearsed justifications, and a version of the truth that was shaped to make me doubt myself again, and I was no longer interested in that version. Instead, I placed the card back in the drawer, exactly where it had been, and I walked into the kitchen, turning on the light even though the sun had not fully set yet, because I needed clarity more than I needed comfort, and I began to move through familiar routines, wiping down the counters, straightening the chairs, doing the small, quiet tasks that had always grounded me. But this time, each action carried a different intention. Not maintenance, but observation, not habit, but preparation. As I stood there, I thought about the wedding again, about the way Vanessa had described it, about the tone she had used, the certainty in her voice, and I understood that whatever had been building was leading to something public, something deliberate, something meant to redefine my place not just within the family, but in front of others. And instead of fear, I felt something else take its place, something calmer, more controlled. Because for the first time, I was not reacting to what was happening, I was watching it unfold, and that made all the difference. I did not rush the days that followed. I let them unfold at their own pace. Because rushing would have meant reacting, and reacting would have meant losing the clarity I had finally gained. So instead I paid attention to schedules, to conversations, to the subtle ways plans were being finalized without ever including me. And the closer the wedding came, the more visible everything became, as if the closer we moved toward that single day, the less careful they felt they needed to be. Invitations had already been sent out. I learned that from a passing comment Vanessa made on the phone while I was in the next room, her voice light and confident as she confirmed the guest count, 260 people, a number she repeated with pride, as if the size of the crowd itself was part of the statement she intended to make. And I stood there quietly, realizing I had never been asked who I might want to invite, never been consulted about family, friends, relatives, or even neighbors who had known Daniel since he was a child, people who would have expected to be included, but that decision had already been made for me. A few days later, a package arrived at the house addressed to Vanessa, a large white box tied with a satin ribbon, and when she opened it in the living room, she held up a set of printed programs for the ceremony, flipping through them with satisfaction, pointing out details to Daniel as if presenting a finished piece of work, and I watched from a distance, waiting, just once, for her to glance at me, to offer even a small acknowledgement. But she did not, and when I eventually picked up one of the programs after she had set them aside, I noticed my name listed in a section near the bottom, not as mother of the groom, not in any position of significance, but simply as a guest, placed between two distant relatives who barely knew me, and I traced the printed letters lightly with my finger, not out of sadness, but out of recognition, because this was no longer subtle, this was deliberate positioning. That evening, Daniel mentioned the rehearsal dinner, explaining casually that it would be held at a restaurant downtown, one of those places with dim lighting and carefully curated menus, and he spoke about it as if he were informing me of something I would be attending rather than inviting me to participate in, and I nodded, asking what time it would begin, even though part of me already knew I would be arriving as an observer, not as someone who belonged to the center of the event. Vanessa added that everything had been planned down to the minute, that speeches would be limited, that the flow of the evening needed to remain smooth and efficient, and she smiled as she said it, the same composed smile that carried more meaning than her words. And in that moment, I understood that control was not just something she exercised quietly. It was something she intended to display openly, to define the narrative in front of everyone who would be there. I spent the next few days preparing in my own way, not by questioning them, not by inserting myself into plans that clearly had no space for me, but by observing, by remembering, by keeping track of every small detail that confirmed what I had already come to accept, that this wedding was not just a celebration, it was a stage, and every role had already been assigned. On the morning I went to pick up my dress from the tailor, I looked at my reflection in the mirror, at the careful stitching, the soft blue fabric that reminded me of something calm and steady, and I adjusted the sleeves slightly, smoothing them down as I had done so many times before at different events throughout my life. And I realized that this time was different, not because of what I was wearing, but because of how I was seeing everything around me, with clarity instead of assumption, with awareness instead of hope. And as I left the shop and stepped out into the cool afternoon air, I understood that whatever happened at that wedding would not catch me off guard, because I had already seen the shape of it forming long before the first guest arrived. The day of the wedding arrived with a kind of quiet precision, the kind that made everything feel carefully arranged long before anyone stepped into the room. And as I walked into the venue, I immediately understood what Vanessa had been building toward. The space was grand without being excessive, rows of white chairs aligned perfectly, soft lighting casting a warm glow across polished floors, and everywhere I looked there were details that spoke of control, of intention, of a vision that had been executed without deviation. I moved through the crowd slowly, greeting familiar faces, some of whom looked at me with genuine warmth, others with polite curiosity, and I noticed how often people assumed I had been involved in the planning, how they complimented the arrangements, the elegance, the coordination, and I responded with a simple smile each time, offering no correction, no explanation, because the truth was not something that needed to be spoken aloud in that moment. It was something that would reveal itself soon enough. When the ceremony began, I took my seat where I had been directed, not in the front row as I might have expected after a lifetime of standing beside my son, but a few rows back, positioned carefully within the larger picture, visible but not central, present but not essential. And I folded my hands in my lap, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breathing as the music started, as Daniel took his place at the front, looking composed, confident, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the boy he used to be, the one who would look into a room just to find me, just to make sure I was there. Vanessa entered with the same controlled grace I had come to recognize, every step measured, every movement intentional, and the ceremony itself passed smoothly, vows exchanged, rings placed, applause rising gently as they were pronounced husband and wife. And through it all, I remained still, attentive, observing not just the words but the spaces between them, the glances, the pauses, the subtle cues that hinted at something more beneath the surface. It was during the reception that the atmosphere shifted, though only slightly at first, as guests settled into their seats, conversations blending into a low hum, glasses clinking softly against one another, and I noticed how Vanessa moved through the room with ease, greeting guests, directing staff, adjusting details that most people would never notice, maintaining control even in the smallest moments, and Daniel followed her rhythm, aligning himself with her pace, her presence, as if their roles had been defined long before this day. I sat quietly at my assigned table, listening, watching, aware of the way certain eyes drifted toward me with curiosity, perhaps sensing something they could not quite name. And then, as the evening progressed, the moment I had anticipated began to take shape. The microphone was passed from one speaker to another, brief toasts filled with familiar sentiments, laughter, light stories, all carefully contained within the boundaries of what was expected. And then Vanessa stood, her posture straight, her expression calm, and the room gradually settled into silence, attention shifting toward her as she prepared to speak. And in that instant, I felt the final piece of the pattern fall into place, not with shock, not with confusion, but with a clarity so complete that there was nothing left to question, only to witness. Vanessa smiled before she spoke, not a nervous smile or a fleeting one, but the kind that settles in place as if it has been practiced, rehearsed, perfected for this exact moment. And when she lifted her glass slightly, the room followed her lead, quieting in a gradual, respectful hush that felt almost ceremonial, and I watched her carefully, not just the words she was about to say, but the timing, the confidence, the certainty that she already owned the room. She began with gratitude, of course, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging the effort it took for guests to travel, to be present, her voice smooth and measured, carrying easily across the tables. And there were nods, soft smiles, the expected reactions, and then she shifted, just slightly, introducing Daniel with a story from their early days together, something light, something harmless, and the room responded with gentle laughter, the kind that warms the space without drawing too much attention. And I noticed how Daniel smiled beside her, relaxed, comfortable, as if everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Then her tone changed, not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice immediately, but enough for me to feel it, like a subtle shift in temperature, and she paused, just long enough to let the room lean in, to create that moment of anticipation that speakers rely on. And when she spoke again, her words carried a different weight. She spoke about family, about influence, about the people who shape us. And for a brief moment, I wondered if perhaps I had been wrong, if perhaps there would be some acknowledgement, some recognition. But then she tilted her head slightly, her smile sharpening just enough to reveal its edge, and she said that sometimes the greatest lessons come from understanding what not to become. There was a ripple of laughter, uncertain at first, then growing as she continued, weaving her words with a kind of casual ease that made them sound almost like a joke, almost harmless, and yet every sentence edged closer to something more direct, more pointed, until she finally said it clearly, plainly, referring to a useless old woman whose only contribution had been to linger in places where she was no longer needed. And although she did not say my name, she did not need to. The direction of her gaze, the slight turn of her body, the way a few heads in the room instinctively shifted toward me, all of it made the meaning unmistakable. There were laughs, some louder than others, some quickly stifled as people glanced around, unsure of how far the moment was meant to go. And I sat there, feeling the weight of 260 pairs of eyes, some curious, some uncomfortable, some quietly complicit, and I did not move. I did not speak. I did not react in the way they might have expected. Instead, I allowed the moment to pass through me without resistance, like a wave that rises and falls on its own, and I lifted my glass slightly, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of what had just been made clear beyond any doubt. Daniel did not interrupt, did not correct, did not even look in my direction, and that absence spoke louder than anything else, confirming what I had already understood, that this was not an impulsive comment, not a misjudgment, but a deliberate act, carefully placed within a setting where it would have the greatest impact. And as Vanessa finished her toast, and the room responded with applause, polite and uneven, I realized that the moment they believed would define me had instead revealed them completely. And for the first time that evening, I felt something steady settle beneath the surface, not anger, not hurt, but clarity, the kind that does not demand immediate action, only patience. I did not leave immediately after the applause faded. I stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary, allowing the room to settle back into its rhythm, conversations slowly rebuilding around what had just happened, as if it could be folded into the evening and made smaller, less significant. But I knew better than that. I knew moments like that did not disappear, they lingered in the air, in the way people avoided eye contact or offered overly polite smiles. And as I finally stood, smoothing the fabric of my dress with steady hands, I felt eyes follow me again, not with the same curiosity as before, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition. I moved through the room at my own pace, acknowledging a few familiar faces, accepting brief words that were meant to be kind but carried an undercurrent of discomfort, and I responded with the same calm composure I had held all evening, because there was no need to rush, no need to explain, not yet. It was near the edge of the reception hall, just beyond the main cluster of guests, that someone stepped into my path gently, not blocking me, but asking for my attention without words. And when I looked up, I recognized him immediately, Thomas Reed, my late husband's attorney, a man who had always spoken carefully, choosing each word with intention, and now he studied me for a moment before offering a small, respectful nod, as if acknowledging not just my presence, but the situation itself. He did not mention the toast directly, did not need to. Instead, he spoke quietly, his voice low enough to remain between us, and he said that he had been meaning to reach out, that there were matters related to my husband's estate that required clarification, updates that had been delayed longer than he was comfortable with. And something in the way he said it made me understand that this was not a coincidence, not a conversation chosen at random. I listened without interruption, my attention focused not only on his words, but on the timing, the setting, the fact that this moment had arrived here, now, after everything that had just unfolded. And as he continued, he mentioned documents, revisions, decisions that had been made under assumptions that might no longer be accurate, and I felt a quiet alignment within myself, as if another piece of the pattern had just been placed exactly where it belonged. I did not ask for details, not there, not in that room. Instead, I simply nodded, acknowledging what had been offered, and I told him we would speak soon, properly, without distraction, and he seemed to understand immediately, stepping back with the same measured composure he had always carried. As I turned away and made my way toward the exit, the sounds of the reception softened behind me. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses blending into something distant and indistinct. And when I stepped outside into the cool night air, I paused for a moment, drawing in a steady breath, not to calm myself, but to mark the transition, because what had been revealed inside was no longer just about perception or feeling. It was something tangible now, something that could be addressed with precision rather than emotion. And as I walked toward my car, I understood that the moment they had chosen to define me had instead given me exactly what I needed, not just clarity, but direction. I did not contact Thomas the next morning or the day after, because timing matters more than urgency when the truth has already begun to reveal itself. And instead I returned to my routines with a quiet sense of purpose, moving through the house with a different awareness than before, noticing not just what had changed, but what had been assumed, what had been taken for granted, and I allowed that awareness to guide me rather than rush me. Vanessa and Daniel returned from their short honeymoon trip 3 days later, their energy light, celebratory, as if nothing of consequence had happened beyond the expected joy of a wedding, and I greeted them with the same calm composure I had maintained throughout. Asking about their trip, listening as they described sunsets and dinners and small details meant to signal normalcy, and I responded appropriately, not cold, not distant, simply measured, because there was no benefit in revealing anything before I had all the information I needed. It was only after the house settled again, after the noise of their return faded into the background, that I reached out to Thomas and arranged a meeting at his office, a place that had always carried a sense of order, of structure, of clarity, and when I arrived, he greeted me with the same careful respect he had shown at the reception, offering no unnecessary commentary, only focus. He laid out the documents methodically, explaining that in the months following my husband's passing, certain updates had been initiated, suggestions made regarding the distribution of assets, the management of the house, the future use of specific accounts, and while none of it had been finalized without proper authorization. The intent behind those discussions had been clear, and as I listened, I recognized the pattern once again, not sudden, not impulsive, but gradual, strategic, designed to shift control over time rather than all at once. There were emails, notes from conversations, requests that had been framed as practical considerations, all tied back to Vanessa's involvement, her influence presented as helpful, supportive, forward-thinking, and Daniel's agreement, quiet but consistent, and I sat there, absorbing it all without interruption, because this was not the moment for emotion. This was the moment for understanding, for precision. When Thomas finished, he looked at me not with concern, but with a kind of quiet readiness, as if he had been waiting for me to reach this point, and I nodded slowly, placing my hands together on the desk, feeling not overwhelmed, not even surprised, but steady, as if everything had aligned exactly as it was meant to. I asked him what steps could be taken to ensure that all decisions moving forward reflected my direct authority, my clear intent, without room for assumption or interpretation, and he outlined the process, the revisions, the safeguards that could be put in place, each one reinforcing something that had always been mine, but had been treated as negotiable. I agreed without hesitation, because hesitation belonged to an earlier version of me, one that had believed understanding would come naturally without effort, without boundaries, and as we finalized the next steps, I realized that what had been taken as silence before would now serve a different purpose, not absence, but control. When I left his office, the afternoon light felt sharper, more defined, and as I walked to my car, I understood that nothing needed to be announced, nothing needed to be explained prematurely, because the shift had already begun, quietly, precisely, and this time, it was not something happening around me. It was something I was directing, and I intended to let it unfold exactly as it should.